We are in the heart of imperial Rome, in the shadow of the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. A high priest, his face a mask of solemn ritual, casts a handful of golden, crystalline resin onto a glowing bronze brazier. A thick, white, and intensely fragrant cloud of smoke billows upwards, its scent filling the air, carrying the prayers of the state to the heavens. This smoke was the scent of the sacred, the aroma of power, and one of the most expensive imported commodities in the entire Roman Empire. Its origin was a jealously guarded secret, a mythical land at the edge of the world, a place the Romans were told was guarded by winged serpents. How did the dried sap of a humble desert tree become the fuel for an entire peninsula's economy and an object of obsession for the world's greatest superpower? To understand the Roman world is to understand a civilization steeped in ritual. Every significant act, from the signing of a treaty to the burial of a citizen, from a military triumph to a simple household prayer, was accompanied by a sacred offering, and the most essential of these offerings was incense. Frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins from the south, were not mere perfumes, they were industrial-scale commodities, the indispensable fuel for the religious machinery of an empire. The demand was constant, it was immense, and it was utterly inelastic. The price was irrelevant when the favor of the gods was at stake. This documentary will investigate the Great Incense Route, the brilliant and immensely profitable economic pipeline that supplied this insatiable demand. This was a trade route built upon one of the most perfect monopolies in human history, a monopoly created by geography and perfected by man. We will argue that the kingdoms of ancient southern Arabia, the fabled Arabia Felix, and the brilliant Nabataean middlemen to their north, engineered a sophisticated, thousand-mile-long desert supply chain that generated almost unimaginable wealth, allowing great cities and powerful kingdoms to blossom in the heart of the world's most unforgiving deserts. Our investigation will follow the scent of the gods from its source to its final destination. We will journey to the remote, mist-shrouded hills of modern-day Yemen and Oman, the only place on Earth where the sacred trees grew. We will uncover the secrets of the harvest and meet the forgotten kingdoms of Saba and Hadramaut who controlled it. We will then join a great camel caravan, the technological engine of this trade, on its perilous 200-mile journey along the western edge of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, the largest sand desert in the world. We will revisit the great Nabataean middlemen at Petra, showing how they built their fortune by acting as the final, most profitable toll gate on this desert highway. And finally, we will arrive in Rome to witness the incense craze and to analyze the immense one-way flow of Roman gold and silver that was the price of this fragrant addiction. This is the story of how the desire for a sacred scent created a sophisticated ancient trade network, funded the rise of desert kingdoms, and held the world's greatest superpower in a state of expensive, aromatic dependency. Before the first camel was loaded, before the first toll was paid, the entire, vast superstructure of the Incense Route was built upon a single, powerful foundation, the Roman world's absolute and unshakable need for its product. To the modern mind, incense is a minor luxury, an atmospheric novelty. But to the Romans, frankincense and myrrh were fundamental industrial commodities, as essential to the functioning of their civilization as steel or oil are to ours. Their demand was immense. It was continent-wide, and it was almost perfectly inelastic, meaning that even as the price skyrocketed, the demand did not fall. This was not a trade in a simple perfume, it was an economy built on the very scent of civilization itself. The primary driver of this demand was religion. The Roman state was a deeply pious and profoundly superstitious entity. Their relationship with their pantheon of gods was transactional. The gods provided security, prosperity, and military victory, and in return, the state and its citizens were obligated to offer constant, reverent, and materially valuable sacrifices. And the most common, most universal, and most necessary of these offerings was the burning of incense. The fragrant white smoke of frankincense was not just a pleasant aroma, it was the physical vehicle, the ethereal medium that carried the prayers and vows of mortals up to the celestial realm of the gods. As the smoke ascended, so did the prayer. This was not a casual or occasional act. It was a daily, industrial-scale requirement. Every temple to every major god, in every city from Britain to Syria, had to have a perpetually burning offering of incense on its altars. Every public festival, Every military triumph, every session of the Senate, every major court proceeding began with a sacrifice that included the burning of frankincense to purify the space and to secure divine favor. The economy of the Roman state religion was, in large part, an economy of incense consumption. To be without it was to risk angering the gods, a risk that no emperor, no senator, and no general was ever willing to take. This created a massive, permanent, and state-sponsored base of demand that was the bedrock of the entire trade. Alongside the sacred role of frankincense was the equally vital and more worldly role of myrrh. Myrrh was a substance of immense practical importance in the ancient world. It was a powerful antiseptic, an anti-inflammatory, and an analgesic. It was a key ingredient in Roman medicine, used in everything from wound dressings and surgical balms to potions for indigestion and antidotes for poison. But its most significant and emotionally charged use was in the rituals of death. Myrrh was the primary aromatic and preservative used in Roman funerary practices. The bodies of the elite were anointed with expensive myrrh-based oils, and the air at their grand funerals was filled with the thick, pungent smoke of burning myrrh, both to honor the deceased and to mask the odors of mortality. This made myrrh an essential commodity, not just for the temples, but for every wealthy family in the empire. It was a deep, structural, and cultural necessity. The demand was driven by the two most powerful and immutable forces in human life, the fear of the gods and the fear of death. A Roman aristocrat might choose to forego a new silk robe from the east, but he would not, under any circumstances, skimp on the incense for his father's funeral or the offering at the temple of Jupiter. This inelasticity of demand was the secret to the immense profitability of the incense route. The producers and the middlemen knew that their customers had no other choice. They had to buy the product, regardless of the price. This immense demand, coupled with a supply that was, as we will see, a jealously guarded and geographically isolated monopoly, drove the price of incense to legendary heights. He notes that the finest quality, saber-toothed frankincense was sold by weight, its price rivaling that of gold. He describes how the workers in the incense warehouses in Alexandria were supposedly stripped naked at the end of their shifts to prevent them from stealing even a single precious tear of the resin. The entire trade was a high-security, high-value enterprise. The scent of the gods was, in the end, one of the most expensive and most profitable smells in human history, a fragrance powerful enough to pull a river of gold and silver from the heart of the Roman Empire into the deserts of a distant, mysterious land. The immense Roman demand for incense created a powerful economic vacuum. The world needed a supplier, and the laws of botany and geography had conspired to ensure that this supplier would be a single, isolated, and highly defensible region at the very southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. This was the land the Romans called Arabia Felix, or Fortunate Arabia. Its fortune was not derived from its soil, which was largely arid and unforgiving, but from its exclusive status as the world's sole nursery for the sacred incense trees. The entire vast superstructure of the Incense Route, with its immense profits and its powerful kingdoms, was built upon the strange and delicate biology of two humble, gnarled, and almost magical desert trees, Boswellia sacra, the frankincense tree, and Commiphora myrrha, the myrrh tree. The frankincense tree is a botanical paradox, a creature of the most extreme and inhospitable environments. It is a small, scraggly, and almost tortured-looking desert tree, its branches tangled, its bark often peeling like paper. It does not grow in fertile valleys or lush oases. Instead, it thrives in the most marginal of lands, clinging to the rocky, sun-blasted hillsides and the dry, gravelly riverbeds, or wadis, of southern Oman, modern-day Yemen, and the Horn of Africa. The secret to its survival, and to its immense value, lies in the network of resin canals that run throughout its bark. This resin is the tree's lifeblood, a potent, aromatic sap that acts as a powerful antiseptic and sealant, protecting the tree from the ravages of the desert heat and from boring insects. This defensive sap was, to the ancient world, the tear of the gods. The harvesting of this resin was, and still is, a delicate and highly skilled art, a form of traditional knowledge passed down through generations. The harvest season began in the spring, when the harvesters, or sakra, would make a series of precise, shallow incisions in the tree's bark with a special chisel-like tool. This wounding would induce the tree to weep, to bleed its milky white, liquid resin, which would then slowly ooze down the bark. The harvester would leave this initial flow to harden and crystallize, a process that ritually cleansed the wound. Weeks later, they would return and make a second, more serious cut. This would produce the main flow of high-quality resin. Over the next several months, the harvesters would return again and again, carefully scraping the now hardened amber-colored tears of frankincense from the tree's trunk. This was a labor-intensive, patient, and almost ritualistic process. The finest quality frankincense, the translucent, whitish tears known as hojari, came only from the specific microclimates of the Dhofar Mountains in Oman, a region shrouded in a mysterious seasonal monsoon fog, the kharif, that gave the resin its unique quality. The entire process was surrounded by a mystique, a sense of sacredness and secrecy. The ancient writers, like Herodotus and Pliny, likely fed tales by the Arab traders themselves, wrote of these incense groves being guarded by small, colorful, winged serpents and other fearsome beasts. While these were fables, they served a crucial economic purpose. They shrouded the source in danger and mystery, a powerful deterrent to any foreign power that might contemplate seizing control of this priceless natural resource. The myrrh tree, a close botanical relative of the frankincense tree, grew in the same harsh, arid conditions. It was an even thornier, more gnarled and more forbidding-looking plant. Its resin was harvested in a similar way, but instead of forming clean, hard tears, it bled as a viscous, reddish-brown, waxy substance that had to be scraped from the bark. This was the raw material for the medicines, the perfumes, and the sacred funeral rites of the Roman world. The key to the great Arabian monopoly was the simple, unalterable fact of geography. These specific species of Boswellia and Commiphora would not grow anywhere else. Attempts were made to transplant them to other parts of the empire, but they all failed. The tree's unique and delicate requirements, the specific soil, the arid climate, the seasonal mists could not be replicated. This was a natural, geological, and botanical monopoly, a gift of nature to the peoples of southern Arabia. They were the sole proprietors of the sacred groves, the exclusive suppliers to a world that was addicted to their product. This absolute control over the source was the first, and most important, pillar of their immense wealth and power. The entire, complex economy of the incense route began here, with the simple, patient act of a harvester making a small, careful cut in the bark of a desert tree and waiting for the gods to weep. The geological monopoly on the incense trees was a gift of nature, but the transformation of that natural resource into an engine of immense wealth and civilization was an act of pure human ingenuity. The people who inhabited the rugged lands of southern Arabia were not the simple, primitive tribesmen that the Romans imagined. They were the architects of a series of powerful, sophisticated, and fabulously wealthy kingdoms that flourished for over 1,000 years. These were the kingdoms of Frankincense Saba, Kataban, Hadramaut, and Myrrh, and they were the first great masters of the incense route. By systematically organizing the harvest, controlling the initial stages of the trade, and wisely reinvesting their profits, they built a civilization of stunning complexity in the heart of a harsh, arid land, a world that truly deserved the name Arabia Felix. The most famous and powerful of these kingdoms was the Kingdom of Saba, a name that resonates in history as the legendary, almost mythical, realm of the Queen of Sheba. While the biblical story of her visit to King Solomon highlights her wealth in gold and spices, the true foundation of her kingdom's power was its control over the prime frankincense-growing territories. The Sabaeans were brilliant engineers and hydrologists. Their capital city, Myrrh, was located not on the coast, but deep in the desert at the edge of the empty quarter. Its existence was made possible by one of the greatest engineering marvels of the ancient world, the Great Dam of Myrrh. The Myrrh Dam was a colossal, sophisticated irrigation system, a massive structure of stone and earth that captured the scarce seasonal floodwaters of the Dana Valley and redirected them into a network of canals that irrigated a vast, man-made oasis. This oasis was capable of supporting a large urban population and producing a massive agricultural surplus. This agricultural wealth gave the Sabaean state its internal stability, but it was a system that was built and maintained by the immense profits of the ancient trade in incense. The dam was a symbol of their genius. They had used the profits from one desert resource, incense, to conquer another desert challenge, the lack of water. The Sabaeans and their neighboring kingdoms were the absolute masters of the incense production economy. They did not leave the harvest to chance. The incense groves were likely owned by the temples or the ruling elite. their output a carefully controlled state monopoly. The kingdoms organized the workforce of harvesters, they managed the collection of the raw resin tiers, and they controlled the first crucial stage of the supply chain. The frankincense would be brought from the remote groves to great temple warehouses in the capital cities, like Myrrh. Here, it would be sorted, graded for quality, and stored under heavy guard. This was the central bank of the Sabaean economy, a treasury filled not with gold, but with a fragrant golden resin of even greater value. The Greek and Roman writers, like the geographer Strabo, describe these kingdoms with a sense of awe and envy. They speak of cities with magnificent temples and multi-story palaces of a people adorned with gold and precious stones. This was not the primitive, nomadic Arabia of the popular imagination. This was a sophisticated, urbanized, and literate civilization with its own unique script, Old South Arabian, and a complex pantheon of gods. They were a major power on the world stage, and their power was derived almost entirely from their monopoly on the scent of the gods. Their business model was one of complete control over the first stage of the pipeline. No caravan could be loaded, no ship could be freighted, without first dealing with the authorities of these kingdoms. They were the primary producers and the sole wholesalers. They would sell the graded incense to the great merchant caravans that were preparing for the long, perilous journey north. The price they charged for this raw material would have been immense, the foundational cost upon which all other profits would be built. They were, in essence, the OPEC of the ancient world, a powerful cartel of producers who controlled a strategic global commodity. This immense wealth gave them a high degree of political and military power. They could fund powerful armies to protect their precious groves and the caravan routes within their territory. And they could engage in the complex diplomacy of the age, sending and receiving envoys from the great powers of Persia, of Egypt, and of Rome. But they were also a civilization that was, in its own way, as isolated as its sacred trees. Their power was entirely dependent on the continued demand for their unique product, and on the functioning of the single great artery of commerce that led from their lands to the north. For centuries, this system was a source of almost unimaginable prosperity, a golden age for the lords of Arabia Felix, the first and most powerful beneficiaries of the great Incense Route. The incense was harvested and consolidated in the wealthy kingdoms of southern Arabia. The demand burned brightly in the temples of Rome, 200 miles away as the crow flies. But between the supply and the demand lay one of the most terrifying and formidable obstacles on the face of the earth, the Arabian desert, and at its heart, the Rub' Khali, the empty quarter, shifting, mountainous dunes, and of a killing, waterless heat. To conquer this barrier, to create a reliable and profitable highway through this void, required a masterpiece of logistical engineering and a revolutionary biological technology. This was the great trans-Arabian caravan, the living, breathing machine that was the true engine of the Incense Route. The entire enterprise was made possible by one creature, the dromedary camel. As in the Sahara, the one-humped camel was the indispensable ship of the desert, the only creature on Earth capable of surviving the extreme rigors of the Arabian wilderness. Its evolutionary adaptations were the foundational technology of the entire trade. Its ability to store immense reserves of energy in its hump, to conserve water with an almost miraculous efficiency, and to traverse both soft sand and hard, rocky ground made it the perfect long-haul desert freighter. But the merchants of the Incense Route did more than just use the camel. They perfected its use in a highly organized and disciplined system. The Great Incense Caravan was a massive, mobile corporation, an enterprise that required immense capital and meticulous planning. A major caravan could consist of over 1,000 camels and hundreds of men, a slow-moving river of life that stretched for miles across the barren landscape. The journey was a high-stakes, high-risk venture, and its success depended on a rigid, almost military organization. At its head was the caravan master, the Kabir, a man whose authority was absolute. He was a master navigator, a shrewd diplomat, and a hardened logistician, his mind a living map of the desert's secrets. The route itself was not a single, wide road, but a fragile and often invisible thread, a chain of essential, life-sustaining oases and wells. The path stretched northwards, hugging the western edge of the Great Sand Sea, a corridor that ran parallel to the Red Sea coast. This was not the shortest route, but it was the most viable, a pathway dictated by the unforgiving logic of water. The distance between these water sources determined the pace and the rhythm of the entire journey. A caravan's survival depended on the Kabir's absolute knowledge of the location of the next well, and his ability to lead his caravan to it before their own water supplies ran out. Navigation was a precise science. In the vast, featureless expanses, the Kabir would navigate by the sun during the day. But at night, the desert would come alive with activity, the journey often continuing in the relative cool. The caravan master would navigate by the stars, a celestial map that was far more reliable than the shifting sands below. He also read the terrain, the shape of the dunes, and the patterns of the wind, a deep, traditional knowledge that was the most valuable intellectual property of the desert tribes. The journey was slow and methodical, a trek of some 65 stages that could take over 2 months to complete. This was not a peaceful journey. The Arabian Peninsula was a patchwork of tribal territories, and the right of safe passage had to be bought. A huge part of the caravan's operational cost was the payment of tolls and protection fees to the powerful Bedouin tribes whose lands the route traversed. This was a complex and often tense process of negotiation. A caravan master had to be a skilled diplomat, building relationships with the tribal sheikhs, paying the expected fees to ensure his caravan would not be attacked by the very people who were offering protection. This system, while expensive, was the security infrastructure of the desert highway, a necessary cost of doing business in a lawless land. The immense profits of the incense trade were what made these payments possible, the wealth of the cargo trickling down to enrich the nomadic tribes who controlled the pathways. The caravan itself was a self-contained, mobile society. It carried not just the precious cargo of frankincense and myrrh, which would have been in the most secure central position, but also all the supplies needed for its own survival: food for the men, fodder for the animals, and immense quantities of water in goatskin bags. It would have had its own armed guards, its own specialists like blacksmiths for repairs, and its own internal rules of conduct. As it moved from the territory of one great incense kingdom to another, and then into the lands of the nomadic tribes, it was an island of commerce, a river of immense wealth flowing through a land of scarcity. The sheer, audacious ambition of this enterprise, the willingness to risk everything on a 2-month journey through a killing wilderness, is the ultimate testament to the immense, almost unimaginable value of the fragrant, solidified tears of a desert tree. After a grueling, 2-month journey of 1,000 miles, the great incense caravans, having survived the perils of the empty quarter, finally reached the northern end of the Arabian Peninsula. They were now on the doorstep of their final market, the Roman Empire. But before they could sell their precious cargo, they had to pass through the territory of one final, powerful, and incredibly sophisticated intermediary. This was the kingdom of the Nabataeans, and they had engineered one of the most brilliant and profitable business models in the history of ancient trade. The Nabataeans were not the producers of the incense, and they were not its final consumers. They were the master gatekeepers, the shrewd and powerful brokers who had positioned themselves as the final, mandatory toll gate on the Incense Route. Their magnificent, rock-carved city of Petra was not a source of wealth. It was a machine for collecting it, the ultimate testament to the immense power and profit that could be accrued by the masters of the middle. The Nabataeans, as we have seen, were a people of the desert, and they used their intimate knowledge of the arid landscape to create their commercial empire. Their kingdom was strategically located at the very point where the great overland incense route from the south finally met the major east-west trade routes that connected Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean. Any caravan wishing to bring its frankincense and myrrh to the great Roman port of Gaza, the primary export hub for the European market, had no choice but to pass directly through Nabataean territory. This geographical advantage was the foundation of their entire economy. But the Nabataeans did not simply sit on the road and demand a tax. They created an infrastructure of desire, a system that actively funneled the trade through their hands. The key to their strategy was their mastery of hydraulic engineering. In the barren, unforgiving deserts of southern Jordan, they had created a series of artificial oases, caravanserais, and secure, well-watered stations. For a caravan master who had just spent 2 months struggling from one meager well to the next, the arrival in Nabataean territory with its abundant managed supply of fresh water would have been like arriving in paradise. The Nabataeans offered safety, security, and refreshment. But this service came at a very high price. The fees they charged were legendary. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, who studied the trade in detail, describes the process with a sense of outraged admiration. He details the numerous taxes and tolls that had to be paid at every stage, fees for the guards, for the gatekeepers, for the priests, and for the royal household. This was not random extortion, it was a systematic, highly organized, and almost corporate system of taxation. The Nabataeans had a complete monopoly on this final, crucial leg of the journey, and they exploited it with ruthless efficiency. The profits they extracted from this toll gate economy were colossal, a massive percentage of the final market value of the incense. They were taking the largest single share of the entire pipeline's profit. This immense wealth funded the creation of their spectacular capital city, Petra. Tucked away in its hidden canyon fortress, Petra was the perfect headquarters for this operation. It was a secure vault where the immense tax revenues could be stored. It was a magnificent display of power, designed to awe the merchants and caravan masters who did business there. And it was a sophisticated commercial center, where the incense could be stored, graded, and perhaps even repackaged before its final sale in the Roman markets. The great rock-cut tombs and temples of Petra are not the monuments of a productive empire, they are the monuments of a middleman empire, a city built entirely on the profits of trade taxes. The Nabataeans were more than just passive tax collectors, they were active participants and market makers. They would have used their immense capital to finance their own caravans, buying the incense in the south and controlling its entire journey to the final market. They were also the primary suppliers of the other goods that the caravans needed: food, water, and security. Their relationship with the powerful Bedouin tribes of the desert was complex. They likely paid some of them subsidies to ensure the safety of the routes, effectively subcontracting the security of their commercial empire. They were the masters of the entire desert ecosystem, a fully integrated service provider for the world's most lucrative trade. The incense pipeline had many beneficiaries, but the Nabataeans, by brilliantly positioning themselves at its most profitable choke point, had engineered a system that made them, for a time, one of the richest and most powerful kingdoms in the Roman world. After its epic, 1,000-mile journey across the desert, and after the final heavy taxes were paid to the Nabataean gatekeepers, the incense finally arrived at the shores of the Mediterranean. At great coastal cities like Gaza, it was loaded onto Roman merchant ships for the last, easy leg of its journey to the ports of Italy. Here, it entered the belly of the beast, the single greatest consumer of luxury goods the world had ever known, the city of Rome. For the Roman elite, the arrival of the incense fleet was a moment of immense satisfaction, but for the accountants of the empire, it was a moment of profound anxiety. The Roman addiction to the fragrant resins of Arabia was creating one of the most severe and persistent trade imbalances of the ancient world, a massive, one-way hemorrhage of the empire's most precious resource, its gold and silver, into the coffers of the desert kingdoms. The sheer volume of incense consumed by the Roman Empire is difficult to overstate. This was not a niche luxury item, it was a strategic commodity consumed on an industrial scale. We have already explored the religious demand, a system that required thousands of temples to be continuously supplied. But the private consumption was equally staggering. The Roman elite, enriched by the spoils of empire, engaged in a culture of conspicuous consumption, a constant and competitive display of wealth. And incense was one of the ultimate symbols of this status. A wealthy aristocrat would have incense burners lit in his villa day and night. His clothes would be perfumed with it, his food flavored with it, and his slaves would carry censers before him as he walked through the city. The use of incense in funerals reached almost absurd levels of extravagance. The funeral of a wealthy Roman was a piece of public theatre, and the quantity of incense burned was a direct measure of the family's wealth and devotion. The historian Pliny the Elder, our great and often exasperated chronicler of the Roman economy, noted that the amount of incense produced in Arabia in a single year was barely enough to satisfy the demands of the funerals in the Roman Empire. He famously recounts the story of Emperor Nero's funeral for his wife Poppaea, where he allegedly burned more than a year's supply of Arabia's entire output on a single funeral pyre. Even if this is a gross exaggeration, it perfectly captures the Roman perception of this commodity. It was a substance to be consumed in vast, almost profligate quantities, a way of literally burning a fortune to display one's grief and power. This insatiable demand, met by a tightly controlled foreign monopoly, created a market of almost perfect inefficiency, and the prices were astronomical. Pliny tells us that the finest frankincense could cost as much as 62 denarii per Roman pound. To put that in perspective, a Roman legionary's annual salary was around 225 denarii. A soldier's entire pay for 3 months could be spent on a single pound of the best incense. This was a market that was ripe for exploitation, and the Arab producers and the Nabataean middlemen took full advantage. The fundamental problem was the same one that plagued the spice trade with India: the balance of payments. The kingdoms of Arabia had little to no interest in the bulk commodities of the Roman world, like wine, oil, or grain. They were a wealthy, self-sufficient culture, and the only thing they truly desired from the Romans was their currency. The ancient trade in incense was not a barter of goods for goods. It was a direct exchange of a fragrant resin for hard cash. This resulted in a massive, and to Roman eyes, terrifying, gold drain. Pliny the Elder, once again, puts a number to this anxiety. He calculated that Arabia takes from our empire no less than 100 million sesterces every year. This was a colossal sum, a significant portion of the entire state's tax revenue, flowing out of the Roman economy and into the hands of the desert kings. This was not just an economic problem, it was a matter of national pride and perceived moral decay. The traditional Roman virtues of austerity and self-sufficiency were being eroded by this decadent foreign luxury. The incense trade, like the silk trade, was seen by moralists as a force that was making Rome soft, effeminate, and, most dangerously, poor. The archaeological evidence for this gold drain is clear. Hoards of Roman gold and silver coins from the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius have been discovered at sites all along the ancient Incense Route, from the ruins of Petra to the ancient ports of southern Arabia. These coins were not just used for exchange. Their high-purity metal was a valuable commodity in itself, often melted down to be reused by local craftsmen. Each coin found in the desert sands is a tiny, tangible piece of the Roman treasury, a silent witness to this vast one-way flow of wealth. The scent of the gods, it turned out, smelled exactly like Roman money. The entire magnificent edifice of the Incense Route, the great kingdoms, the powerful middlemen, the vast caravans was, in the end, built and paid for by the gold and silver of the very empire it held in its fragrant thrall. For centuries, the great overland incense route had been an unassailable monopoly, a fortress of commerce protected by the twin ramparts of geography and secrecy. The Arabian kingdoms controlled the source, and the Nabataean middlemen controlled the desert highway. The Romans, as the final consumers, were forced to pay the exorbitant prices demanded by this long and complex supply chain. But the same Roman ingenuity and imperial ambition that had conquered the known world was now being applied to the problems of trade. In the 1st century AD, Roman sailors, harnessing the revolutionary knowledge of the monsoon winds, achieved a breakthrough that would shatter the old desert monopoly forever. They learned how to bypass it. The rise of the maritime incense route was a classic tale of technological disruption, a story of how a new, more efficient sea lane made the ancient, land-based highway increasingly obsolete. The engine of this disruption was the mastery of the Indian Ocean monsoons. As we have seen, this knowledge allowed Roman ships to sail directly from their Red Sea ports to the coast of India, shattering the Arab monopoly on the spice trade. But this new highway of wind had another, equally important consequence. A ship sailing to India had to pass directly by the coast of southern Arabia, the very heartland of the frankincense and myrrh production. The same winds that carried the pepper fleet to Muziris could also carry a different fleet to the frankincense port of Cain, the modern Kainar in Yemen. This was a geopolitical and economic game-changer. The Romans were no longer dependent on the 1,000-mile-long, toll-ridden, and dangerously unpredictable camel caravan route. They could now send their own ships, crewed by their own sailors, directly to the source. The ancient text, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which served as a mariner's handbook for these new routes, describes this direct trade in frankincense with a matter-of-factness that belies its revolutionary importance. It lists Cain as a major port, noting that it is a center for the frankincense that grows in the nearby mountains, and it details the goods that should be traded there. The secret was out. The mystique and the carefully guarded geographical monopoly of the overland route was broken. The economic advantages of the sea route were overwhelming. A single Roman merchant ship could carry a cargo of incense that would have required a caravan of hundreds of camels to transport. This created an economy of scale that the land route simply could not match. The costs of transport plummeted. The sea journey was faster, it was more direct, and while still dangerous, it avoided the endless chain of tolls and taxes demanded by the dozens of tribal sheikhs and, most importantly, by the powerful Nabataean kingdom. The maritime trade offered a way to cut out the middlemen entirely. The impact on the old overland route was devastating, particularly for the Nabataeans. Their entire magnificent economy, as we have seen, was built on their position as the final indispensable toll gate on the land route. Their capital at Petra was a glorified service station and customs house for the desert highway. The new sea route made them almost completely irrelevant. A Roman merchant could now load his ship with incense at Caen, sail up the Red Sea to a Roman port like Berenice, and transport the cargo across the short desert road to the Nile, completely bypassing Nabataean territory. The Nabataean kingdom was now cut out of the loop. The river of gold that had flowed into Petra, the profits from the taxes on the world's most lucrative trade, began to dry up. We see the consequences in the archaeological record. In the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, the great monumental tomb construction at Petra, the ultimate expression of the city's immense wealth, slows and then stops almost entirely. The city, while still a regional trading hub, lost its central, world-defining importance. The Roman annexation of the Nabataean kingdom in 6 AD was not the cause of its decline. It was the final, political consequence of an economic reality that had already taken hold. The Romans were simply absorbing a state whose primary business model had already been bankrupted by their own maritime innovation. For the kingdoms of southern Arabia, like the Himyarites who now dominated the region, the situation was more complex. They still controlled the source of the incense, and the demand was still strong. They were now simply selling their product to a different customer, the Roman sea captain instead of the Arab caravan master. But even for them, the new system weakened their position. They had lost the ability to play the long, overland supply chain off against the sea route. They were now dealing directly with the organized, overwhelming economic power of the Roman state and its merchants. The prices were likely more competitive, and the profit margins were likely squeezed. The maritime disruption was a classic example of a new technology and a new business model rendering an old one obsolete. The camel caravan, the ship of the desert that had ruled the Arabian trade for 1,000 years, had finally been outmaneuvered by the true ships of the sea. The Great Incense Route, a pipeline that had defined the economy and the politics of ancient Arabia, had been fatally wounded, its long, slow decline now inevitable. The Roman mastery of the sea lanes had broken the old overland monopoly and fundamentally wounded the caravan kingdoms. But the demand for incense itself, the great engine of the entire southern Arabian economy, remained strong for centuries. The final, slow fading of the incense route was not just a story of a shifting trade route, it was the story of a shifting world, a story of how a profound, deep-seated cultural and religious revolution within the Roman Empire would eventually extinguish the very desire that had fueled the trade for. A millennium. The scent of the gods would slowly be replaced by the faith in a single god, a faith that, in its early days, had no need for the fragrant smoke of pagan ritual. Even after the rise of the maritime route, the great kingdoms of southern Arabia, like the Himyarite kingdom which came to dominate the region, remained incredibly wealthy. Their direct trade with the Roman fleets continued to bring in a steady stream of gold and silver. They were still the sole producers of the world's finest incense, a commodity that was deeply embedded in the fabric of Roman life. But the old system, the great overland pipeline with its powerful middlemen and its immense layered profits, was in a state of terminal decline. The city of Petra, its commercial heart torn out, slowly faded from a bustling metropolis into a beautiful but quiet provincial backwater. The great camel caravans, while still plying the desert routes for regional trade, were no longer the arteries of a global economy. The first major shock to the entire Roman system, as we have seen in other contexts, was the crisis of the 3rd century. The half-century of civil war, plague, and economic collapse that ravaged the Roman Empire had a devastating effect on the demand for high-end luxury goods. In a world of insecurity and hyperinflation, the market for the most expensive grades of frankincense and myrrh would have shrunk dramatically. The immense conspicuous consumption that had defined the early empire gave way to an age of anxiety and austerity. The state itself, lurching from one crisis to the next, would have had less surplus wealth to spend on the lavish temple rituals of the past. The demand, for the first time in centuries, began to falter. But the most profound and permanent shift was not economic, it was spiritual. As the old certainties of the Pax Romana crumbled, a new religion, born in the Roman province of Judea, began to spread across the empire with a message of salvation and a single, universal God. This was Christianity. And in its early days, the Christian faith defined itself in direct opposition to the pagan world it sought to replace. The early church fathers railed against the idolatry of the old gods, and they specifically condemned the central act of pagan worship, the burning of incense. For early Christians, the scent of burning frankincense was not the scent of prayer, it was the stench of paganism. It was the aroma of the very temples where they had been persecuted, the smell that accompanied the sacrifices they were ordered to make to the emperor's divine genius on pain of death. Tertullian, an early and influential Christian writer, declared that the service of idols is the parent of all the world's pomp, and he explicitly condemned the incense trade, boasting that Christians do not buy frankincense. The new faith was not just a different theology, it was a different, sensory world, a world that, at least initially, had no place for the most valuable commodity of Arabia. As Christianity grew from a persecuted minority to a tolerated religion, and, finally, with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century to the new state religion of the Roman Empire, the consequences for the incense economy were catastrophic. The old demand, which had been guaranteed by the state-sponsored rituals of thousands of pagan temples, was systematically extinguished. Emperors now used the state's wealth not to build temples to Jupiter, but to build great churches to Christ. The old pagan temples were closed, their altars grew cold, and the daily industrial-scale consumption of frankincense came to a grinding halt. The demand for myrrh in funerary practices also declined, as Christian burial rites, with their focus on the resurrection of the body rather than its preservation, had less need for the expensive aromatic. The entire ideological foundation of the 1,500-year-old Incense Route had been shattered. The scent of the gods was no longer needed, because the old gods were dead. Ironically, the Christian church would, in later centuries, readopt the use of incense in its own high church rituals, valuing it for the very same sense of awe, sanctity, and connection to the divine that the pagans had. But by then, the old world was gone. The great, unified Mediterranean market of the Roman Empire had fragmented. The ancient kingdoms of southern Arabia, their primary customer and their entire reason for being gone, had faded into a long period of decline and obscurity, their monumental dams crumbling, their great cities returning to the sand. The great highway of desire that had connected their remote peninsula to the heart of a global empire had finally, after a millennium and a half, reached its end. Our investigation began with a cloud of fragrant smoke, the scent of a prayer rising to the heavens in ancient Rome. We sought to understand the vast and mysterious economic network that supplied this sacred commodity. Having followed the incense route from its exclusive source in the remote groves of Arabia Felix, across the punishing sands of the empty quarter, and through the masterful toll gates of the Nabataean kingdom, the evidence is now clear. The verdict is that the incense route was a brilliant and immensely profitable pipeline economy, an enterprise built upon one of the most perfect monopolies in history, a monopoly of geography, perfected by man, and fueled by the unshakable religious beliefs of the ancient world. We have established that the demand for frankincense and myrrh was not driven by simple luxury, but by a deep-seated and inelastic cultural and religious necessity. For the great empires, particularly Rome, these resins were an indispensable industrial commodity, the essential fuel for the rituals of the temples, the rites of the dead, and the display of imperial power. This sacred demand created a market in which price was a secondary concern, the perfect condition for a profitable monopoly. Our investigation has confirmed that the source of this commodity was a true natural monopoly. The unique botanical requirements of the Boswellia and Commiphora trees meant that the entire global supply was controlled by the powerful, sophisticated kingdoms of southern Arabia. They were the sole producers, the masters of the harvest, and the first great beneficiaries of this geological lottery. We have charted the course of the great desert highway that carried this precious cargo north. We have shown that this route was a masterpiece of logistical engineering, made possible only by the revolutionary technology of the camel caravan and the deep traditional knowledge of the desert peoples who guided it. And we have identified the crucial role of the great middlemen, particularly the Nabataeans, who transformed their control over the final northern choke point of this pipeline into a fortune that built the magnificent city of Petra. Finally, we have charted the long decline of this ancient system. we have shown how the land-based monopoly was first disrupted by a new technology, the Roman mastery of the monsoon sea lanes, which allowed them to bypass the costly desert route. And we have concluded that the final, fatal blow was ideological, the rise of Christianity, which systematically extinguished the pagan religious demand that had been the trade's primary engine for over 1,000 years. Therefore, the final conclusion of our investigation is this: the incense route was a complete and highly sophisticated economic ecosystem. It created immense wealth, built powerful desert kingdoms, and for a millennium held the Roman Empire in a state of expensive, fragrant dependency. It was a perfect example of how a monopoly on a single, high-demand and geographically isolated resource can be transformed into immense geopolitical and economic power. The scent of the gods in the end was the scent of money. The great camel caravans no longer traced their 1,000-mile path along the edge of the empty quarter. The magnificent city of Myrrh lies in ruins, its great dam a memory in the sand. And the scent of frankincense no longer fills the air of the Roman Forum. The incense route, as a great artery of global economy, has faded into history. But its legacy is a profound and enduring one. It is a timeless lesson in how the most powerful forces in human history are often the most invisible, the deep-seated beliefs, the sacred rituals, and the shared ideas of value that can compel a civilization to move mountains, or in this case, to cross deserts in their pursuit. The story of the incense route is the ultimate testament to the power of a belief-driven economy. This was a trade that was not built on a biological need, like the trade for salt, or on a military necessity, like the trade for tin. It was built on the abstract, yet unshakable, conviction that a specific, fragrant smoke was the necessary medium for communicating with the gods. This idea was so powerful that it generated a river of gold, funded the rise of sophisticated desert civilizations, and dictated the foreign policy and balance of payments of the world's greatest superpower. It is a profound reminder that the great engines of history are not always rational or practical. They are often born from the deepest and most powerful currents of human faith. The route also stands as a classic case study in the geopolitics of a monopoly. The kingdoms of Arabia Felix and the Nabataeans were masters of a precarious but incredibly profitable game. Their story is a masterclass in how to leverage a geographical advantage to the absolute fullest. They controlled the source, they controlled the pathway, and they controlled the price. For a millennium, they were the gatekeepers of the sacred, and they made the world pay dearly for the privilege of passage. But their story is also a cautionary tale. It reveals the inherent vulnerability of a land-based monopoly in the face of maritime innovation, and the danger of a business model that is dependent on a single, unchanging cultural demand. When the world learned to sail around them, and when that world's core beliefs changed, their entire economic edifice crumbled. Today, the scent of frankincense and myrrh is, for many, a nostalgic aroma, a scent of ancient rituals and distant histories. But the echoes of the great ancient trade they fueled are still with us. They are in the archaeological ruins that speak of a lost, wealthy Arabian civilization. They are in the enduring cultural connections between the Horn of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the wider world. And they are in the timeless economic principles that their story so powerfully illustrates. The incense route is a profound reminder that behind every great fortune and behind the rise of every great civilization, there is a desire. And for 1,000 years of human history, one of the most powerful desires on earth was the simple, sacred, and incredibly valuable scent of the gods.